My name is Steffi Malm, and I have the pleasure to moderate this session, and that is the only role I have here to frame this book launch in the series of Druckfrisch, which is actually a series that has quite some history already. It's a project outcome that we will present here today that was launched 3 years ago, I would say, roughly, in a moment in which the world already was in turmoil, very much centered around discussions about the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war that has, of course, not started in 22, but has received major attention in that year. And with it, an unleashed political, public, but also academic debates worldwide, but also specifically across Europe, to make sense of that moment, of that rupture. And we were sitting with a group of like-minded people here in Leipzig. Leipzig is a place that combines excellent expertise in Eastern European histories of all its variations, disciplinary as well as sub-regionally, but also a place that combines excellent area studies research and transregional perspectives. So we also discussed how to make sense of that moment and what could be a contribution of a group of scholars to this discussion. And against the background of the Leibniz Science Campus, Eastern Europe as a global area that brought together the Leipzig University as well as the Center for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe, the Leibniz Institute, whose director is in the very back of this room, Maren Röger, and the other Leibniz Institute that deals with the region for regional geography, whose director is also sitting in the background of that region. It's a pleasure to have you here. That Leibniz Science Campus has provided before the war already a forum for the discussion and conversation between scholars looking at Eastern Europe in transregional and global perspectives. So the initiative to that project, to that book, came from within that campus by also colleagues who cannot be here today, including Matthias Midel, but also other scholars such as Ulf Engel, who have also been part of the discussion, the reviewing and the debates around that project, as well as excellent master students of various area studies institutes here who helped us to develop this idea further, to locate material and to challenge us with our conceptualizations. I say always us, because I've been part of that endeavor at the very beginning. Then I left it, not because I didn't like it, but because I didn't have the resources to speed it up and not to slow it down further. And it's now a pleasure to be at this very end of the process here, moderating here and seeing how you have produced a wonderful volume, which I had the chance to already have a look into. So when we started the discussion, we also thought about how to actually approach this war, this caesura moment, from a transregional perspective that goes beyond the European theater. And we discussed a variety of angles, how to conceptualize the globality of that moment, ranging from including perspectives of non-European actors on the war, looking at how Ukrainian as well as non-Ukrainian actors are reflecting the transregional or global nature of the war, but also looking into how global issues such as climate change, food security, questions of health, armament, military cooperation come into the picture and are reconfigured through the war, as well as looking at narratives of the globality. So not simply assuming that the war is a global rupture, but also looking into how this globality actually is presented and shaped. Although some might have the impression that talking about the war in Ukraine is not any longer up to date, and there's so many other wars around and has actually lost its prominence, I would say it's a very timely moment for this volume to come out, in a moment in which we are still confronted with being in the midst of a moment in which international order is massively in turmoil, global alliances are reshaped. We are still not yet ready in understanding one fragmentation, while the next ones are already happening, while we also have seen how geopolitical debates around other wars, including Gaza, Sudan, Iran, as well as other territorial new ideas, including Greenland, have contributed to a discussion on how is the European order, the European position actually reconfigured in a global context. And even though this might have drawn media attention away from the war in Ukraine, what we've seen, on the other hand, is a massive professionalization and expansion of Ukrainian society, reaching out to global partners worldwide. This includes also professionalization in terms of area studies in Ukraine, as well as the development of new global initiatives. So we see not a uniform movement around the conflict, but different forms of addressing its transregional nature. And we've also seen how much more recent wars, more prominent wars in the media, such as the war in Iran, are actually massively entangled with the war in Ukraine, with shifts in the global energy market, actually promoting massively the Russian war effort. So we cannot move away from understanding the complexity of that moment. So therefore, I would say that there's dire need of understanding this war, this moment in transregional context. And I think that there's no better place than doing this in Leipzig with a group of excellent scholars that are both highly specialized in the region as well as open to look beyond it. Before I go into the presentation of the speakers of today and then give them the room for presenting the book, as well as giving the floor to our wonderful commentators of tonight, then giving you the floor to discuss, and then at the end, sometime, maybe in 90 minutes or so, there might be some wine waiting sponsored by the Südosteuropa Society. Before we get into medias and res, I also would like to give the floor to Katja to also present the framework in which this book will appear, because this is also a very special moment of the launching of a new series.
Indeed, thanks very much. And could you please turn the first slide on? Because contrary to the book that we're going to present, the series in which it will appear is already out there and is being filled with life. So we are still, although our book is not there, we are inaugurating this book series today, which GWZO is doing in cooperation with Central European University Press. You see that here, the wonderful name GWZO Studies on Central and Eastern Europe, which displays interdisciplinary approaches to culture, history, and the environment, and which really seeks to offer in its GWZO and Leipzig tradition differentiated and multifaceted insights into the region against a broader story of entanglements and disentanglements. The two editors, one is here and has already been mentioned, Maren Röger. The other one, Julia Herzberg, is probably known to some of you, is absent today. They have collected an editorial board, which we display here, because it shows that we really try to have a transnational, trans-European East-West cooperation visible in that series. What needs to be known is that it is English-speaking, but that it's also open access, which means that all the books, including ours, as soon as they are there, can be downloaded. And I just thought I'd bring the flyer for those who are interested. Maybe you can pass it around. Because as a new series, I think there is still space to submit manuscripts. I hope I speak in the name of Maren and Julia, and especially also in the name of Gael Fischer, who is also here in the room, whose name you find on the flyer, because she coordinates that series and is probably open to answer all questions that you might have in the next 90 minutes. So let's then afterwards also cheers on that series. Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks, Katja. So let me introduce those sitting here at this table, while I will later on take the opportunity to introduce our commentators who join us online, which is why the hybrid format here is also very important. It's a pleasure to welcome again. We do this more often, Stefan and Dennis, to do these roundtables. It's always a pleasure. Let me introduce Stefan Rodewald, who many of you will know in this room. He's one of the 4 editors of this book and has held the chair for Eastern European and Southeastern European history here at Leipzig University since 2020. He's a transregional scholar in many respects, combining expertise on Eastern Europe and the Middle East, which is also reflected in many of his academic activities and publications, among them only to mention the DFG priority program Transautomanica, which has been extremely productive in rethinking the way of how we write Eastern European history together with Persian, Ottoman histories as a contribution also to the histories of mobilities and transfers. And Stefan has published widely in this regard, both on mobilities as well as on specific regions and places. So I think that everybody is aware of that portfolio. The second editor that I would like to introduce is Katja Krasik-Naumann, who is a historian who is also based here in Leipzig at the GWZO, and Katja has worked for quite some time on transregional and transnational entanglements in different ways, and has profoundly also contributed to rethinking European history in these global and transregional dimensions. She has a very international portfolio and career as well, studying across Europe and the US, and has also been very active and important as one of the editors of Cooperative, as well as of the Connections as one of the online journals that promote and facilitate a conversation about transregional and transnational perspectives. Dennis Dirks, the third in the row, is a historian who joined us in Leipzig since 23. He's a specialist on Eastern and Southeastern European history, specifically also working on Muslim modernities, memory cultures, looking at also post-conflict societies, speaking an impressive amount of languages, which also is important for the material that we have been working at here. And he joined us in Leipzig after positions in Mainz and Jena, and also has contributed to the Transautomanica program that was led by Stefan Rodewald, as well as in a Jean Monnet network on applied European contemporary history. Last but of course not least, Lena Delliwater is among the 4 editors, who's currently the scientific coordinator of the research school at the Excellence Cluster in Jena. So that's a very recent position. So we're also exporting excellence, I would say, because Lena has worked for quite some time here in Leipzig, also did her PhD here in the Global Studies program, but also been very important as a coordinator, scientific coordinator, both at the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography, as well as also in the context of a DFG priority program. But in addition to this coordinating task, Lena already has an impressive record of edited volumes, as well as her monograph coming out of the PhD on Pan-African aesthetics has also appeared last year. So we have a wonderful combination of Eastern European expertise and non-European, non-Eastern European expertise from a transregional perspective that has led to the production of that volume. And now we are all very curious to learn more about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Given the fact that the book we are presenting is not really printed, Druckfrisch suggests something else. We are well aware of the fact. I was told today by the publishing house that it will be published June the 30th latest. Perhaps we can speed up it a little bit. It's not up to us because we submitted everything. So still, there is a manuscript existing which can be discussed, which will be discussed by the discussants. It's known to us, it's known to the discussants, not really known to you, whether printed or not. So what I would like to do is to give you a very short, rough overview of what we are doing in this reader, of our approaches and the material we collected. So to give you a chance, to invite you to challenge our approaches, to discuss them, to ask questions you are interested in. So the aim of this reader is to document a process still going on, a process of how the perceptions of globality were changed and still are changed due to the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. So the basic assumption of this book is that this was some kind of watershed moment in the whole world, an event that impacted societies all over the world, and therefore caused different processes of renegotiating what we frame globality. That means worldwide interconnectedness. In this volume, in this reader, we are focusing on two aspects of globality, globalization, and world order as global power relations, and at the same time their regulation. So when we started this project, we thought it might be interesting to have a look at periodicals worldwide and to ask how this process of renegotiating globality is documented in these periodicals. So at the end, we compiled a selection of 24 articles, mainly published between the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and Donald Trump's re-election in November 24, which we considered another caesura, another watershed moment globally perceived as such. So our collection comprises articles taken from daily and weekly newspapers, from all kinds of academic journals, blogs, as well as magazines, political and cultural magazines. We have compiled texts written originally in English, but also published in other languages, which we translated. So we have also texts originally published in Arabic, in Chinese, in French, in German, in Polish, in Portuguese, in Russian, Serbian, Spanish, Turkish, and Ukrainian. So our claim and aim is to have a really global collection comprising also a wide range of texts published in a wide range of languages. Very briefly on the structure of the reader. When we collected the material, we of course had to figure out how to organize, how to arrange the material, and while discussing these different articles, some kind of 6 topical clusters popped up in some way. The first being, and that certainly no big surprise, international organizations and international law. So we present texts discussing the question of how the war in Ukraine might motivate reorganization of the United Nations, or texts discussing the application of international law from very different angles. Some, and you see an example here from the Egyptian daily newspaper Al-Akhbar, the news, arguing that there is a biased, imbalanced application of international law by the International Court of Justice. So a bias favoring Ukraine, and the question how international, in the framework of international law, the war in Ukraine is dealt with in comparison to the war in Gaza, for example, or other conflicts in Muslim countries or affecting Muslim countries. The second chapter is in very ways connected to the first one, discussing the issue of power relations, global power relations from a postcolonial and decolonial perspective. So we have collected texts referring either explicitly to post or decolonial discourse, citing authors like Edward Said or Walter Mignolo, or in some way indirectly referring to these kinds of discourses, formulating criticism of global power relations. And this is interesting again because we have material from societies from outside Europe, where this is always made in some way of Western criticism of Western power politics. But we have also texts from Ukraine perceiving and appropriating post-colonial discourse in a very different way when criticizing and deconstructing Russian neo-imperialism. The third chapter focuses on the perspective of the nation state and the question how nation states should reposition themselves in the new world order, focusing on the question of rearmament, neutrality, non-alignment. So there are a lot of discursive elements reminiscent of the Cold War time, and there is explicit reference to the Cold War era. A totally different perspective is presented in the fourth chapter, focusing on religious solidarity. So given the fact that Ukraine is a multi-religious society, the global perception of the war is also informed by the idea that there's some kind of orthodox pan-Muslim, pan-Islamic, Jewish solidarity, trans-solidarity. And another topic addressed in this chapter is the question of religiously based ideas of world order. For example, as concerns Muslim societies, the idea of Ittihadul Islam, the unity of Islam, or the idea of Ruski Mir, which is partly based on religious ideas as well. The last two chapters are focusing on questions of economy. This is not very surprising. So the question of how the war impacts globalization from different angles, food security being a very important issue. And the last chapter focusing on ecology, the question of the war's impact on global climate politics, as well as the question of how decarbonization of global economy could impact, have an impact, make a difference concerning Putin's war chest, because this is mainly financed by the export of fossil fuels. And then we have two epilogues. And this is something we did not plan at the beginning, but when collecting the material, when discussing how to arrange it, it became clear that our basic assumption, our starting point is in some way debatable, because in a lot of texts we found the idea that our perception of the war is no global perception. So the idea of a global watershed moment this war might mean was challenged in a lot of texts, arguing that the crisis of world order began before the war with a global finance crisis, or COVID, or other moments of critical change. And of course that there are other conflicts, wars, which are as important or even more important. And one of them often addressed was the war in Gaza. So we decided to collect some texts discussing the relation between the two wars. You see here a Ukrainian example by a young writer, Irina Kravchenko, Trump Gaza #1, referring to this infamous AI generated video clip about the future of Gaza, and she asked whether this might have an impact on American visions for Ukraine as well. And the second epilogue reflects the question of how the re-election of Donald Trump impacts the future world order, and of course also the perception of the war in Ukraine. So one question which might pop up and which we also could discuss here is, why doing a reader, why doing a collection of sources, why not publishing an edited volume or handbook, something like that. So, of course, our approach has advantages and disadvantages. I think the most important advantages are undoubtedly the fact that by presenting these sources, original texts, and in some way the original sound of authors worldwide, we can make perspectives from different parts of the world heard, unknown perspectives, especially to Western readers, and so present a great variety of conflicting views, also provoking discussion, but also restoring the possibility of global dialogue. What we also can do, and a lot of us are interested of the editors in global intellectual history as well, so we can map the circulation of what we aim to present, and what I think we really succeed to present is an intellectual laboratory of how world order and globalization are negotiated by different actors, and this is something the other panelists will now focus on in more detail.
Thanks a lot. And don't be afraid. It is true. All of us, Stefan, Lena, and I will say something now, but we will only focus on some aspects because we're really looking forward actually to the comments that are being made. So as you, I think by now understood, is that our book documents and it documents to inspire, because as Dennis said, it documents on how perceptions of the world order and global interactions have changed in the course of the war. And we want to document that because we want to inspire. We want to inspire future research on how the world since long has been made and shaped by Ukrainians, not only in war-ridden times, and in turn also to encourage global studies of the Ukrainian past and present. We do believe, and we think you share that with us, that this research is relevant for academic teaching, but we do not only address you and our colleagues and students in Ukrainian and Eastern European and global studies. Ideally, the book would also reach out to academic and non-academic audiences, including policymakers. Because, and this is one of the things that we would like really to stress, because the texts display the different and really often surprising ways in which different groups, journalists, academics, analysts, and activists have observed and interpreted the global shifts caused by the war. We mentioned the languages, but I want to say once again that the articles that we republished, they were written in Nairobi and Johannesburg, in Istanbul, in Beirut, in Cairo, in Kolkata, in Beijing, in Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, in Kiev, in Belgrade, in Warsaw, in Helsinki too, as well as in Paris, London, New York, Bonn, Halle, and in Gaza. The texts mirror the locations in which they were written, and yet at the same time, many of the authors wrote for audiences that span across languages, borders, and regions. In the survey of many more texts than we could actually include in the book, and with its 500 pages, it's long enough, we were astonished to see how interwoven these commentaries often were, how interpretations circulated and were appropriated elsewhere, adding and changing layers of meaning. Now, many authors, where we could actually look at the biographies themselves, work and publish transnationally. So one of the insights we really want to convey is that the efforts to understand and to explain the current shifts are also transnationally intertwined in many ways. A second insight, and I limit myself to 3, a second insight that we gained and explain in our brief introductions concerns pattern of difference. For instance, while the war is usually not related to other crises in European and US American public opinion, comments written in African contexts discuss the war in line of the COVID pandemic, the 2008 financial crisis, or the threat of climate change. So when we started, and Dennis pointed it out, we were convinced that everywhere the war would be seen as a watershed. We found out not for all and not everywhere. Internationally, the mass violence against Palestinians following Hamas' brutal attack has shaped views tremendously on the war in Ukraine, and as well as discussions on neo-imperialism, much more than we tended to think, and Lena will come back to this briefly. And while in our part of the world, the war is discussed mainly, and I think we all agree, as a flagrant violation of international law and as a watershed moment in global relations in the so-called South, it is often viewed as just another breach of international law. Their long-term experiences of the subversion of international rules for geopolitical self-interest are coupled with well-established critiques of double standards, impacting their understanding strongly. Revealing are in this regard particularly the interpretations by authors from the Ukraine, which we include, and Stefan will come back to that. To be short, I single out one more insight. We document analyses, positions, interpretations that obviously, although we sometimes tend to forget, serve distinct and competing interests and that are linked to very different agendas regarding the future of the world order. So in other words, as much as the world has been changing due to the war, it is also changing in and due to the reflections and debates about the war and its global consequences. We have tried to document this second layer as good as possible, and we really hope that this anthology, once it's out and can be downloaded, will inspire you and everybody else to delve deeper into these complicated stories of observing a war and interpreting it. And Dennis already mentioned the date, so the 30th of June would be the point to look again at the website of that book series and to see whether it's already downloadable. But okay, now, Lena, you will continue, right?
I think it's Stefan's turn first too.
I should not have been introduced first, as I was asked to join the latest. So the invasion of Ukraine by endless Russian tank columns at the ensuing full-scale war represents the largest Überfall in Europe since the Second World War. The resistance against this at first seemed without chances and was not supported as broadly as Ukraine could have hoped for. Moreover, and this shows our volume, the view on the events between Russia and Ukraine from around the globe are calibrated along local or regional cleavages and not these decolonial perspectives that, especially from a Ukrainian point of view, rather paradoxically seem to support the Russian neo-colonial stance. Thus, although being at the core of the historiographical debate since the 19th century, colonial dimensions of Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Ottoman history have been reformulated, not least in the context of this global misperception of the last 10 years. Tamara Hundorova, represented in the volume, has for 20 years been contributing for this at least. If the election of Trump, and here I hope I don't overstep what I should say in this window, if the election of Trump and the dwindling American support for Ukraine or even the outright US support for Russian positions has changed something, then it has increasingly made clear that Ukraine has always and is acting on its own, for its own right, and surely not on behalf of the United States. This also changes the perception of what are the consequences of this war for changing power configurations across the globe. Russia obviously not being able to conquer Ukraine day by day, this runs counter to its global aspirations and makes it an ineffective regional power at best, dependent on North Korean support. Today, but also with the war in Syria and very intensely observed in Ukraine, Eastern European history and Near Eastern history is being entangled more and more intensely, reminding trans-Ottoman configurations where some few transregional powers were dominating but not able to rule the world. Although Iran has been delivering strong material support for Russia for years, being used directly in its warfare against Ukraine, Russia is, because of its war against Ukraine, which proves to be an imperial overstretch, is not able to support Iran as strongly as it likes today. As the US, on the other hand, is not able to impose its will on Iran and China and Russia, although both have holding naval trainings with Iran in February this year, just days before the war, are not able or for now willing to change much about the Strait of Hormuz. But in contrast to Russia, China would have the real potential to influence this. Facing China, the US, Russia, and Iran, each according to Carl Schmitt, claiming its exclusive sphere of influence, be it Greenland, Ukraine, or the so-called South China Sea with its sea routes, or the Strait of Hormuz, Europe cannot count anymore on the US and has to reorganize its stance. Ukraine today sees itself and sells this stance in a situation where it concludes treaties with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, as these are disappointed by the US and dependent on know-how to fight Iranian drones or blockades of seaways. Ukraine has experience with this. Ukraine, in such a world, is changing from having been the absolute underdog to de facto becoming one of the most important supporters of the European Union in its stance to claim a position within a very messy pentarchy. As trans-imperial configurations are becoming the norm again, why should they be less messy than during the early modern period?
Okay, thank you. That's difficult to follow now. Much has been said already, and I wonder what I can already cross out from my list. As Katja mentioned, my brief contribution builds on the two epilogues that in the reader that Dennis presented at the beginning. This means that I'll offer a glimpse into other events that have triggered the negotiation of globality during our period of focus, which is 2022 to 2024. And I will mention them again. The two epilogues are firstly Ukraine and Gaza, relations and comparison, and then the second one focusing on the US presidential elections in 2025. And we found those two issues very pertinent. So this means the first section of the two-part epilogue presents three articles that document and interpret the connections between the conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, and the West Bank, connections whose significance extend beyond these regions and poses challenges to the current international order. The second part of the epilogue then addresses Donald Trump's re-election as President of the United States in November 2024, along with the measures and legislative changes he has introduced since then. The epilogue thus presents texts that reflect on the global consequences of Donald Trump's return to office, and they offer insights into how developments surrounding the war of aggression against Ukraine, the armed conflict in Gaza and in the West Bank, and Trump's second presidential term intersect or are interpreted in relation to one another. The epilogue highlights three such points of convergence, which are first, migration, second, neocolonialism, and third, financial capitalism. And I wonder if we may want to come back to these connections and also these three key points in the discussion that follows. What is important at this point might be that the themes of the second part of the epilogue painfully extend into the present day. As Der Spiegel reported last week, Ukrainian negotiators have apparently proposed in recent talks on the war with Russia, renaming a contested part of the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine Doniland. this reflects, so the New York Times, a global reality in which government appealed to Trump's vanity in order to draw US power to their side. I'm quoting in the New York Times. So with this glimpse into the present day, I think I would like to leave it at that and would hand over to Steffi again for her moderation. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've learned now a lot about what the book promises to offer, but we are also very much curious and excited to hear what the first readers of this book have to tell us. And I would like to introduce the two commentators that you see online. And I wonder if we can stop sharing the presentation so that we can see Franziska Davis and Andrei Portnov in a bigger screen. And while we somehow solve that technical riddle, I will introduce Franziska Davis and Andrei Portnov. Both of these are probably also known to you, as you are here to hear more about the war in Ukraine. But still, I would give it a try to introduce Franziska Davis first. She's an historian of Eastern Europe more broadly, and known as certainly one of the most respected public voices on issues related to Ukraine and Russia and the ongoing war. Franziska Davis studied at in Munich with periods of Sheffield and St. Petersburg, and did her PhD with a book on Muslims in the Russian army. After many years in Munich, she moved last year to Potsdam to the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History, where she now works as a senior researcher. And in addition to being a scholar in a proper academic setting, Franziska Davis is very active in publishing in a variety of media outlets, not only academic journals, but also journals addressing a wider public, including Merkur, Osteuropa, Süddeutsche Zeitung, as well as Decoder. So you might have come across her work in which she brings, I would say, clarity to and also sharpness to contemporary debates on Russian imperialism, violence, and memory politics. For this work, she also has received a number of awards already, including the Zeit Foundation Translation Prize and the Bavarian Book Prize for her book that she published with Katja Marotina, Offene Wunden Europas. And among her recent books, I would like to mention Die Ukraine in Europa, that looks at in essay forms on Russian aggression, disinformation, and politics of memory. So in addition to her, Andrei Portnov will be the second commentator and first reader of this book, who's known as one of the most prominent historians of Ukraine today, I would say. Born in Dnipro, he studied there and in Warsaw, and earned his PhD on Ukrainian intellectual life in interwar Poland, so already specializing very much on this transnational dimension of Ukrainian history. And that is somehow also reflected in his academic career that spans universities across Europe, encompassing a number of institutions, and also in the US, while he has held since 2018 the chair of Entangled History of Ukraine at the European University Viadrina, where he also directs the Prisma Ukraina in Berlin, which is a major platform for research on Eastern Europe. Andrei Portnov has published an impressive number of articles and books already, monographs, not only edited volumes. So there's a lot more to read into. And this work ranges from Ukrainian historiography to also analysis of the Russian concept of Ruski Mir. Also, his work has been awarded a number of prizes, including the Jerzy Gidroc Prize, the Yuri Shevelov Prize, and the Dialogue Prize of the German Polish Society, which reflects how much his work is appreciated in a number of different academic communities. To mention just a few of his books, Dnipro, An Entangled History of European City, that appeared in 22, as well as his essays on Poland and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Asymmetric Memories, as well as a number of further books that are preisverdächtig. I don't know, say this in English. So we are looking very much forward to your both comments. I don't know who wants to start, Franziska or Andrei. Ladies first, I think. So Franziska, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. First, I would like to congratulate the editors to this volume. I think it's a very, very important work, and just very briefly point out that it opens up perspectives which are very much underrepresented in the public discourse, probably more broadly in Western discourse, but also specifically in German discourse, where so much, and that's a point I will get back to later, so much seems to be also a story about ourselves. So we're not really talking about Ukraine and Russia, but about our own anxieties, or possibly also our changed what Gerd Köhnen called the Russland complex of the Germans. So this kind of weird romantic fixation large parts of German educated society had towards Russia. This Russland complex has now been really challenged. I mean, it should have been challenged much further, and it's one of the aspects of this, that it took such a genocidal war for many to question it. But I think sometimes there still seems to be a tendency in the German discourse to really talk about ourselves rather than about what is going on in Ukraine and what is going on in Russian society. So it's a volume which opens up perspectives which even people who follow debates quite closely, like I do, there are really quite a few texts which were new to me, because I don't follow public debates in India or in African countries. So things which also are not really part of my bubble, and I do consider my bubble one which is actually quite well informed due to our professional activism. So I think it's very, very useful. And it's also, I think, an important volume to study with students. So to give students really source material with which they can work in a wide range of topics related to the war in Ukraine. And also, of course, a volume which is of interest both to researchers who work on Ukraine and Russia, but also those who work on the presence of Western colonialism. And I think that is, on a more general level, this is something I'm also very interested in, to bring together the researchers of Russian colonialism with the researchers of Western colonialism and how it is nowadays talked and discussed about by affected former colonies, affected societies. And I think this is a very important material through which we can approach this subject. My impression was it is at the same time a document of global dialogue, so in a way a source book of communication, and at the same time a document of the failing of communication and the failing of understanding, which I think ties back to this question of Russian colonialism. So one of the speakers already pointed out the lack of understanding, or the amazement at many in Ukraine, that countries which had been affected by Western colonialism profoundly, who were victimized by Western colonialism, failed to see the neo-colonial nature of Moscow's aggression, of Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. And this leaves Ukraine in a peculiar position. From what we can gather at this point, this non-recognition of Ukraine as a victim of colonialism has little to do actually with Ukraine, but more with the legacies of Western colonialism in the affected countries. So because so many of the Western powers, like let's not talk about Donald Trump's America now, but so many of the Western powers, Biden, when the full-scale invasion happened, were very, very clear about their support for Ukraine. I mean, we can talk a lot about whether it was enough, or whether it was too little on a factual basis, but on a rhetorical level, it was made clear that this is an unjust war of aggression. And because Western powers, especially the United States, had themselves a violent past in their own policies towards countries of the global South, for the lack of a better word, this was really a legitimacy, the credibility crisis, a lack of credibility for countries like the United States or the West, whatever that may be more broadly, to come out against imperialism, because the European history isn't US history, actually really the history of colonial subjugation. So you people are really not the best to lecture us about what constitutes a neo-colonial war. And this, of course, leaves Ukraine in a very precarious position, because on the one hand, Ukrainians want to emphasize, and I think they are right on an analytical level, that this is a neo-colonial war, and it's not the first colonial aggression or colonial policy Russia has acted out against Ukraine. But this fate is not recognized on the one hand by countries who experienced Western colonialism, or large parts of the societies in these countries. I mean, there are also in the volume, and I think this is also important, there are a few articles which try to point this out. There is actually a connection between the Indian experience and the Ukrainian experience. But from what I gather, the writers who do make this point at the same time are criticizing that in their own societies they are in the minority. So most Indians wouldn't agree, for example, one of the contributions argued along these lines, that too many people do not see this, or Muslim states do not see that Crimean Tatars are also being victimized in this war. So there are voices who do make this point, but from what I could understand, mostly from a position where they are criticizing that they belong to the few people who do see this connection. And I think one way of understanding this is what I just pointed out, that is actually the lack of credibility of Western powers to speak about the evils of colonialism and imperialism. And perhaps also, which Tamara Hundorova also pointed out in her contribution, that a large part of Ukrainian history was about being recognized as European. So on the one hand, showing and wanting the belonging of Ukraine to Europe be recognized, but on the other hand, being the victim of Russian colonialism and not of Western European colonialism, which not only led to a lack of understanding that Ukraine also experienced colonialism in many countries of the global south, but also, on the other hand, Western intellectuals also didn't recognize to a large degree that colonialism doesn't only come in its Western form, but that Russia also has a history of this. And I found this point Tamara Hundorova makes, that maybe to speak of decolonization rather than post-colonialism is a way out of this analytical trap. I also found it interesting that there were a couple of contributions I read, or sources I read, texts which were included, which I read, which of course instantly kind of even made me a little angry. But a source book should, of course, sometimes do this. For example, the contribution by Angelika Clausen, which kind of talked a lot about how bad all of this is for climate change. And of course, I agree, it is very bad. But she didn't really seem to have an answer apart from there has to be a ceasefire, without addressing that there's exactly one country in this war which does not want a ceasefire, and that, of course, is Russia. But I think this is also something which is important to show up these very different perspectives from different disciplines, from different political backgrounds on the war in Ukraine. And another contribution, which I found it very interesting and important, and I think this does give an angle for new research questions about the parallelity of the war between Hamas and Israel and the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the perceptions of how the West is dealing with these wars is very different. So when we came back to the lack of credibility of Western governments, one of the reproaches is that European powers, the European Union, European countries, the United States, have not been as clear in condemning Israel's war in Gaza as they have been in condemning Russia's attack on Ukraine. I'm not an expert on Israel, but of course this is something which is very hotly debated, but also obviously perceived quite differently. For example, I read in the contribution by Przemysław Urbanczyk that the war in Ukraine is overshadowing the war in Gaza. And my personal perception was rather the war in Gaza is overshadowing, in the media coverage at least, the war in Ukraine. But this is really a perception, a personal perception. So I think it would be really actually interesting to do an empirical analysis of these questions, because perceptions are all well and good, but we know as historians how biased we are. So to actually have empirical evidence, what is the relationship? Is there more coverage of Israel's war against Gaza and against Hamas than between Russia and Ukraine? What are exactly the kind of media waves of covering these wars in Western media? So I think all of this gives perspective for future research, but also because then we are again at the level of Western discourse, but also more concretely, what can we say about connections, also biographical connections between these wars? One example was the Ukrainian woman who lived in in Gaza to in 2000 since 2007 or something. I think who moved there with her Palestinian husband. But of course, we could also look at, which was covered quite a bit in the Ukrainian media when the attacks on northern Israel happened after October 7th. Some Ukrainians had fled the war from Ukraine and moved to Israel and were then targeted by Hezbollah or Hamas, and to kind of also look at these kind of connections which go beyond discourse, but actually kind of lived connections. Perhaps also something which I find very interesting. I think I've already been a little bit too long, so I now would like to finish my comments, but just as in general, I think it will. It's not only a good introduction and source book, but it also gives loads of ideas for further research, which I think such a reader is really what it should do.
Thank you very much, Franziska. So that is the first impression, which I think already gives a lot of room for the discussion, so the audience will have the opportunity as well. But first, Andrei Pot, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening, dear colleagues in Leipzig. Sorry for not being able to join you. I'm sitting now in Warsaw, also giving some talks here, and I could say the same, of course, as Franziska just said, that I failed to read the entire manuscript, but I read parts of it. And it's very impressive. So again, my congratulations to all the editors, also all the authors involved, and of course to the GWZO, that in my view is one of the most promising and important institutions in researching, how should we say it now, like Central and Eastern and Southern Europe in Germany. So that's a very important contribution, and I would say that I've been kind of waiting for a book like that for some time, because dear colleagues, I remember it pretty well. For instance, one of the first big debates about the Russia's invasion into Ukraine, it was in spring 2022 in Munich. And I came there to Munich, and I remember how I tried, actually in a very delicate, but maybe it was too delicate, in a very delicate way to argue that we should not limit the scope of our attitude to what is going on in Ukraine to a local conflict, not just to two so-called ungleiche Brüder, brother nations or whatever, something among the Slavs, but to look for a broader context. And I should tell you that a lot of participants in this debate, German and non-German, they were like extremely unhappy about this attitude. They said, come on, you're just like making your own case as a Ukrainian. It's an local conflict. It should be like look back to Soviet times and so on. So what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to say that in fact this war now is kind of like a commonplace after so many years, and so many violence and so many mistakes. It is kind of commonplace to everyone that it has, of course, its local dimension. This local dimension is still very much unclear, because I could mention, hope it's not a secret, my conversations to the German politicians, for instance, who asked me many times, from time to time, who asked me, Andrei, explain us why Donbass is so important for Putin, why Putin is wanting Donbass. And when I try to say it's not about Donbass, again, they were very often disappointed. So it has both local dimension, and it has a dimension which is much broader, let's say global or transnational or transregional, whatever. I don't know, maybe I would remind you, not just adding to the book, but remind you, and let us not forget that one of those influences, direct influences of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, Russia's war against Ukraine, is not, of course, just the way how the war is done. I mean, on those drones and technologies, and we see it again in Iran nowadays in all its in all its strength, but let us also not forget that exactly, and it's no coincidence in my view, that exactly during the war, this big war, something very important happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan, right? So Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, if you wish, and all the implications of this territorial change to the entire, let's say, political, cultural, and whatever space of the former Soviet republics. Yeah, what happened to Armenia afterwards, and to Azerbaijan. Again, no coincidence that President of Ukraine was in Azerbaijan last week, right? Then the decision of Sweden and Finland to join the NATO. Especially interesting, of course, the Finnish case, yeah, because in the beginning of the war, especially, a lot of so-called experts advised Ukraine to follow the Finnish example and to become a neutral state, as it was like the result, of course, of the Second World War, yeah, and before that, the so-called Northern or Soviet-Finnish War. But paradoxically, if you wish, due to the events in Ukraine, Finland became the NATO member, yeah. Or what happened to Syria. Or again, I find it's very important, dear colleagues, that you have in the book this chapter about environmental issues, right? Again, this aspect, in my view, could be explored further. Yeah, we have actually literally a couple of days ago this so-called anniversary of the Chernobyl catastrophe, right? And we have again Chernobyl and Belarus involved in the Russian aggression in 2022. We also, let us also not forget, actually, it's one of my personal observations, if I may say so, how this war, how it influenced the political and social attitudes to the COVID pandemics, because it's now kind of like forgotten, but I do remember that when the European Union decided to open its borders to Ukrainian refugees, displaced persons, yeah, let's not call them refugees because it's not legally correct, displaced persons, right? It was not like kept according to the restrictions of the COVID times. And I remember myself, like when I brought my parents from the border, we crossed the German border, and then we all have to put masks because it was still obligatory to wear masks in the trains and so on. And then it came to an end. So I think this, let's say, logic of finding aspects, drones, COVID, environment, and so on, international law, of course, it should and could go further, and it could bring us a lot of like interesting points here. Now, I have maybe like two more, I don't know, just observations after reading those texts and other texts. So the first one is that what again Francisca mentioned many times, of course, this entire post-neocolonial issue. I think it's very interesting and important, and maybe to do even more in this direction than it was done so far, to analyze precisely how this anti-colonial rhetoric is used by official Kremlin, and how this official Kremlin propaganda is perceived, for instance, in Africa. Because it is perceived very positively, yeah, or in some other countries of the so-called global south. And actually, we have this very interesting intellectual competition, if you wish, that both sides, so Russia and Ukraine, they are both reflecting on the colonial and post-colonial rhetoric, but of course with a very different claim. And they have a different enemy in this claim. And actually, I would enlarge this approach also to the war in Gaza, and also to ask, like, who is then the enemy and who this like claim is directed upon. And then we can find a lot of interesting aspects in this relation. Having said that, I think it is also very interesting to reflect that Ukraine gradually, it is still moving, like it's still ongoing, gradually moved from just being perceived as a battlefield, yeah, as a space where something terrible happened, to be acknowledged as an agent, as an actor, historical actor, current political actor. But again, in doing this process of acknowledging the agency of Ukraine, in my view, we still need, desperately need, if I may say so, a new analytical language to capture what is going on in Ukraine, in Russia, but also in the Middle East, in Africa, in other parts of the world. So that's the biggest challenge, in my view, for humanities nowadays, to find this new analytical language to talk about all those phenomena. And if you find it, like, of course, in different disciplines, not just history, but also sociology or linguistics or anthropology, economy, then hopefully we could come ourselves closer to understanding the world that we have now, let's say, when the post-Second World War world order is dying like before our eyes. And I believe that your book, this publication, will be an important milestone in this discussion, in this search for a new analytical language. So I wish you good luck. Thank you very much for inviting me today. And yeah, again, best greetings from Warsaw. Hoping to see you all in person soon. Thank you.